Class 11, today we are starting with this chapter Birth by A.J. Cronin. In this excerpt from Citadel by Andrew Manson, a newly out of medical school has just begun his medical practice as an assistant to Dr. Edward Page in the small Welsh mining town of Blenheim. So this is a story about Andrew Manson, who was a new pass out, a fresh pass out from a medical college. Now, Manson, as a practitioner, he was working as a medical assistant to Dr. Edward Page in a small Welsh mining town of Blenheim. As he is returning from a disappointing evening with Christine, the girl he loves, he is met by Joe Morgan. Joe and his wife, who have been married nearly 20 years, are expecting their first child. So the story, we can say, revolves around this person, Andrew Manson, who is a medical practitioner. He's a fresh pass out from a medical school. And currently he is assisting Dr. Edward Page in a small town of Blenheim. Now, Andrew Manson is returning from a disappointing evening. He met his lady love, Christine, that day. And the meeting was very disappointing. Perhaps there was a clash or there was a fight between two of them. So he is really very unhappy and very sad that day. When he's coming back, he meets Joe Morgan. Now, Joe and his wife, they have been married now almost 20 years. And that was a time that they were expecting their first child after 20 years of marriage. So we understand that the child was really very important for them because they had a long wait of 20 years after their marriage. And then they were expecting a child. So let's start reading the text. Riddhi, you can complete one page and then I can give the explanation page-wise. Please start reading.
Though it was nearly midnight when Andrew reached Bryngover, he found Joe Morgan waiting for him, walking up and down with short steps between the closed surgery and the entrance to the house. At the sight of him, the burly driller's face expressed relief. "Eh, doctor, I am glad to see you. I went back and forward here this last hour. The Mrs. wants ye before time too." Andrew, abruptly recalled from the contemplation of his own affairs, told Morgan to wait. He went into the house for his bag. Then together they set out for number 12 Blena Terrace. The night air was cool and deep with quiet mystery. Usually so perceptive, Andrew now felt dull and listless. He had no premonition that this night call would prove unusual, still less that it would influence his whole future in Blinley. The two men walked in silence until they reached the door of number 12. Then Joe drew up short. "I'll not come in," he said, and his voice showed signs of strain. "But man, I knew you will do well for us."
Okay. So the beginning of the chapter itself clears that Andrew Manson was coming back. He was really very sad, very depressed. Perhaps the meeting with his girlfriend, Christine, was very disappointing one. And when he was walking up and down with short steps, he found Joe Morgan waiting for him. So short steps between the closed surgery and entrance to the house. So he was standing just at the entrance of his house. At the sight of him, the burly driller's face expressed relief. So just as Joe found Manson, he expressed that gave that expression of relief. We can imagine when a person is actually in need of a doctor, and especially at the midnight when you do not get a doctor easily, and you find a doctor when you're really in need. So how do you feel at that time? So he was like, "Hey doctor, I'm really glad to see you." He said that I've been back and forward here this last hour. The Mrs. Wanty, the Mrs. here is the spelling, you might find it wrong, but actually it refers to Mrs. MRS. He's saying that is what he wants to convey, that his wife wants the doctor before time too, before the actual time before the time of the delivery was expected. So she was in trouble before that only. So Andrew abruptly recalled from the contemplation of his own affairs. Now, Andrew was, as I told you, he was upset because of his meeting with Christine. So he tried to come out of his contemplation and he told Joe Morgan, to wait. Now, this is something in the introductory part yesterday I told you that a doctor's profession is where you have to be on your toes every time, 24 hours. When a patient is really in need, when the question is about somebody's life, you cannot say no. No matter what emotional strain you are going through, no matter you might not be feeling well, but then when somebody's life is at stake, then the profession, this is the noble profession where you can never say no. So he immediately went into the house for his bag, and then they together set out for number 12, Blena Terrace. That was the address for Joe Morgan. So the night air was cool and deep with quiet mystery. Usually, Andrew now felt dull and listless. He had no premonition. He had no idea. He had no premonition. He had no idea that this night is going to be a life-changing night for him. It's going to be an unusual night because because of that night, perhaps his entire future is going to stand upon. His career is going to take a twist. The two men walked in silence until they reached the door of number 12. Then Joe drew up short. When they reached the house, Jordan walked into the room. He said, I'll not comment. And his voice showed signs of strain because he was so much under pressure. Perhaps he was not able to see his wife in pain, right? But man, I know you will do well for us. Now, this is a kind of a pressure upon the doctors also when the patients are looking at the doctor or the family members are looking at the doctor with that hopeful eyes that you are going to do for us, because generally we do believe, right, God is there for everybody, but then on earth we say the lifesavers, God is our doctors, especially during these times also, when we actually during these COVID times, when actually they are known as the frontline warriors, they are putting their life at stake to save other lives, right? So we know people are looking at them with a lot of hope that the magic only they can do it, right? So here also we find Joe Morgan telling him that I know you will do well for us, you are going to do the best for us. Let's continue further.
Inside, a narrow stair led up to a small bedroom, clean but poorly furnished, and lit only by an oil lamp. Here, Mrs. Morgan's mother, a tall, grey haired woman of nearly 70, and the stout, elderly midwife waited beside the patient, watching Andrew's expression as he moved about the room. Let me make you a cup of tea, doctor, said the former quickly after a few moments. Andrew smiled faintly. He saw that the old woman, wise and experienced,
Please continue.
realized that he saw that the old women, wise in experience, realized there must be a period of waiting that she was afraid he would leave the case, saying he would return later. Don't fret, mother, I'll not run away. Down in the kitchen, he drank the tea which she gave him. Overwrought as he was, he knew he could not snatch even an hour's sleep if he went home. He knew, too, that the case here would demand all his attention. A queer lethargy of spirit came upon him. He decided to remain until everything was over. An hour later, he went upstairs again, noted the progress made, came down once more, sat by the kitchen fire. It was still, except for the rustle of a cinder in the grate and the slow tick-tock of the wall clock. No, there was another sound, the beat of Morgan's footsteps as he paced in the street outside. The old woman opposite him sat in her black dress, quite motionless, her eyes strangely alive and wise, probing, never leaving his face. His thoughts were heavy, muddled. The episode he had witnessed at Cardiff Station still obsessed him morbidly. He thought of Bramwell, foolishly devoted to a woman who deceived him sordidly, of Edward Page, bound to the Swiss bloodwen, Shrewish Broadwin of Denny, living unhappily apart from his wife. His reason told him that all these marriages were dismal failures. It was a conclusion which, in his present state, made him wince. He wished to consider marriage as an idyllic state. Yes, he could not otherwise consider it with the image of Christian before him. Her eyes, shining towards him, admitted no other conclusion. It was the conflict between his level, doubting mind and his overflowing heart which left him resentful and confused. He let his chin sink upon his chest, stretched out his legs, stared broodingly into the fire. He remained like this so long, and his thoughts were so filled with Christine that he started when the old woman opposite suddenly addressed him. Her meditation had pursued a different course.
Okay. Now, in this page, we find basically he was waiting. He went inside the room. He had a look at the lady who was in pain. Mrs. Morgan's mother was there. She was a tall, gray haired woman of around 70, and a stout, elderly midwife waited beside the patient, waiting Andrew's expression as he moved about the room. So, let me make you a cup of tea, doctor, said the former quickly after a few moments. So, mother said, let me make you a cup of tea. But at the same time, the old woman, Mrs. Morgan's wife, Mrs. Morgan's mother, she was really scared. She was an old lady who was obviously who had a lot of experience, and she realized that there must be a period of waiting, that the doctor need and the family members need to wait, because perhaps the labor pain started much before the actual delivery time. So she was afraid that if the case would be complicated, then the doctor might not return back. So doctor on this tried to relieve her by telling her, "Don't fret, mother. I'll not run away. I'll take care of her." So down in the kitchen, he drank tea, which the lady gave him, and then he was there. He knew he could not snatch even an hour's sleep because he had to take care of Mrs. Morgan. Again and again he had to go to examine her, though the stress which was there upon his mind because of that meeting, it was still there, uh, but he was trying to overcome it. And an hour later he again went upstairs. He examined the patient, and it was still, some time was still there, and there was some kind of sound coming up, and he realized that even Mr. Morgan was waiting desperately outside the house only. The old woman opposite him sat in a black dress, quite motionless, and her eyes strangely alive and wise, and perhaps, yeah, she was staring at the doctor, looking with those hopeful eyes that, doctor, it's all upon you and you are going to do it for us. So his thoughts were heavy muddled. He was thinking about his friends who were deceived by uh, women, and still they were in love with them, and all these things, also these thoughts were coming in his mind while the time when he was waiting for Mrs. Morgan's delivery. Now, his reason told him that all these marriages were all dismal failures, and it was a conclusion which, in his present state, made him win. So, in his present state, he was just trying to overcome that all these people had suffered because of their lady love. So, there is no point crying for all these things. He wished to consider marriage as an idyllic state. Yes, he could not otherwise consider it with the image of Christine before him. Now, her eyes shining towards him admitted no other conclusion. It was a conflict between his level, doubting mind, and his overflowing heart, which left him resentful and confused. So, his thoughts were filled with Christine, and when an old woman opposite suddenly addressed him, her meditation had pursued a different course. So, there was some reaction in the patient, so his thoughts were interrupted when somebody informed him about that. So, basically, here we find that though he is there to examine the patient, some time is required for the delivery. It's not immediately happening. So the doctor has to wait. Now, while he is sitting all alone, while he's sitting idle, doing nothing right now, his mind is occupied with all the negativities, all the thoughts, all the disappointment which he had after meeting Christine. And he was just, thoughts coming up in his mind about his friends who were deceived by their lady love and all these things, the failures in marriages. And he was just thinking about all these things. And now, because there was some reaction, about the after the there was a different course, so somebody had called him and now he was going there. Let's continue.
Suzanne said not to give her the chloroform if it would harm the baby. She is awful set upon this child. Dr. Batch, her old eyes warmed at a sudden thought. She added in a low tone, "Aye, we all are, I fancy." He collected himself with an effort. "It won't do any harm, the anesthetic," he said kindly. "They'll be all right." Here the nurse's voice was heard calling from the top landing. Andrew glanced at the clock, which now showed 3:30. He rose and went up to the bedroom. He perceived that he might now begin his work. An hour elapsed. It was a long, harsh struggle. Then, as the first streaks of dawn strayed past the broken edges of the blind, the child was born, lifeless. As he gazed
Okay,
at the
just a
still
second,
form, a
please.
shiver of
Wait,
horror.
Riddhi, just give a pause here. Let me explain this stanza because then it's going to be more elaborative one. Suzanne said not to give her the chloroform if it would harm the baby. So now the lady there, the old lady, she informed him that please do not give chloroform. It may be harmful for the baby. As we all know, the medication for pregnant women is doctors need to be very careful because the medicines cannot be really very strong as the impact can be seen on the child also. So here the lady warned the doctor that Suzanne, maybe her previous doctor or a nurse, she told not to give chloroform. It may harm the baby. So he collected himself with an effort, and the doctor has said that it won't do any harm. It's an anesthetic. He said kindly, they'll be all right, and both of them will be all right. It won't do any harm to them. Here, the nurse's voice was heard calling from the top landing. Andrew glanced at the clock, which now showed 3:30. So it was 3:30, mid of the night, almost early dawn, we can say. He rose and went up to the bedroom. He perceived that he might now begin his work. So now it was a time when the doctor's work started because he had to deliver the baby. An hour elapsed. It was a long, harsh struggle. Then, as the first streaks of dawn straight past the broken edges of the blind, the child was born lifeless. Now, the first streaks of dawn straight past the broken edges of the blind, through the blinds, the first streaks of the early morning rays would enter into the room. The child was born lifeless. The child was not living. The child was not breathing. Let's continue, please.
As he gazed at the still form, a shiver of horror passed over Andrew. After all that he had promised, his face, heated with his own exertions, chilled suddenly. He hesitated, torn between his desire to attempt to resuscitate the child and his obligation towards the mother, who was herself in a desperate state. The dilemma was so urgent, he did not solve it consciously. Blindly, instinctively, he gave the child to the nurse and turned his attention to Susan Morgan, who now lay collapsed, almost pulseless, and not yet out of the ether, upon her side. His haste was desperate, a frantic race against her ebbing strength. It took him only an instant to smash a glass ampule and inject the medicine. Then he flung down the hypodermic syringe and worked unsparingly to restore the flaccid woman. After a few minutes of feverish effort, her heart strengthened. He saw that he might safely leave her. He swung round in his shirt sleeves, his hair sticking to his damp robe. "Where's the child?" The midwife made a frightened gesture. She had placed it beneath the bed. In a flash,
Okay,
Andrew knelt down,
please continue.
finishing amongst the sodden newspapers below the bed. He pulled out the child, a boy perfectly formed. The limp, warm body was white and soft as tallow. The cord, hastily slashed, lay like a broken stem. The skin was of a lovely texture, smooth and tender. The head lolled on the thick neck. The limbs seemed boneless.
Okay. Now, As the child was born lifeless, he gazed at the still form of a shiver of horror. Obviously, uh, Andrew Manson was really shocked and he was really very scared. There was a tremendous pressure upon him. When it's not just about doctor and patients, it's about, I think it's human tendency. When your parents look upon your children with a lot of hope, yes, this child is going to be a life changer for all of us. He is holding a bright future, not just for him but for the entire family. Without saying something, they expect a lot from you, and without replying back to them verbally, you commit a lot to them, right? So if something, God forbids, if something goes wrong and you don't make up according to their expectations, then the pressure is actually upon you. Even if they do not say a word to you, you feel like hopes were upon you. You were the one who could change the entire course of life for them. But because you were not able to do it, their desires, their hopes are shattered, right? So here also the doctor had that kind of feeling. A lot of pressure was there upon the doctor. His face heated with his own exertions, chilled suddenly. He hesitated, torn between his desire to attempt to resuscitate the child and his obligation towards the mother. Obviously, he had that obligation towards the mother. First, we find Joe Morgan, who told the doctor initially that, I know you can do it for us. Then the mother, who was looking at his at Andrew Manson with with her hopeful eyes, and obviously Suzanne Morgan too, right? Suzanne Morgan, who is delivering a baby, the lady who is in pain, right? The mother. Now, he just took a moment and he realized that first of all he need to take care of the lady also, whether she was fine or not. The dilemma was so urgent that he did not solve it consciously. Blindly and instinctively, he gave the child to the nurse and turned his attention to Suzanne Morgan, who now lay collapsed. So he gave the child to the nurse and he turned towards Suzanne Morgan to check whether she was fine or not. Almost pulseless, I mean, she was without any energy, almost lifeless. The energy, I mean, after putting in so much effort in delivering that baby, she didn't have energy at all. She was almost pulseless and not yet out of either upon her sight. His haste was desperate, a frantic race against her ebbing strength. So it took him only an instant to smash a glass ampule and inject the medicine. So he injected the medicine, then he flung down the hypodermic syringe and worked unsparingly to restore the flaccid woman. So to bring her back to life, to give some sort of energy that she's fine, to ensure she's fine, he injected some kind of the hypodermic syringe with some kind of medicine, and after a few minutes of feverish effort, her heart strengthened. So now the lady was in a better position. After a few minutes, he saw that he might safely leave her. So he left her. He swung around in his shirt sleeves, his hair sticking to his damp robe. Where's the child? The midwife made a frightened gesture. Now, the midwife, the lady standing there, she made a gesture. Where is the child? She had placed it beneath the bed. The nurse, in order to hide the lifeless child, that the family might not immediately start reacting, so she had hidden the child under the bed. In a flash, Andrew knelt down. Fishing amongst the sodden newspapers below the bed, he pulled out the child, a boy perfectly formed. So he pulled out the child from the bed with the newspapers, and the child, it was a boy, baby boy, who was perfectly formed. Means there was no problem with the formation of the body parts. The limp, warm body was white and soft as tallow, as the hard fat of animals melted and used to make soap and candles. So the body, the flesh was absolutely soft, just like newborn babies have. The cord, hastily slashed, lay like a broken stem. The cord, which is connected to the mother's cord, we all know that. So that was hastily, in a hurry, it was hastily slashed like a broken stem. And the skin was of a lovely texture. The skin was really charming. A newly born child is absolutely, the skin is so sensitive, it's so soft and so charming. It has its own glow when it comes out of the mommy's womb. So the baby was very smooth and tender. The head lolled on the thin neck, and the limbs seemed boneless. But the limbs seemed boneless means they were so soft, the limbs were so soft as if there were no bones inside it. But the point here was that the child, physically, he was well formed. There was no kind of deformity was there, but the child seemed to be lifeless. He was not breathing. Please continue.
Still kneeling, Andrew stared at the child with a haggard frown. The whiteness meant only one thing: asphyxia, pallida, and his mind, unnaturally tense, raced back to a case he once had seen in the Samaritan, to the treatment that had been used. Instantly he was on his feet. Get me hot water and cold water, he threw out to the nurse, and basins too. Quick, quick. But, doctor, she faltered, her eyes on the pallid body of the child. Quick, he shouted. Snatching a blanket, he laid the child upon it and began the special method of respiration. The basins arrived, the ewer, the big iron kettle. Frantically, he splashed cold water into one basin. Into the other, he mixed water as hot as his hand could bear. Then, like some crazy juggler, he hurried the child between the two, now plunging it into the icy, now into the steaming bath. 15 minutes passed. Sweat was now running into Andrew's eyes, blinding him. One of his sleeves hung down dripping. His breath came pantingly, but no breath came from the lax body of the child. A desperate sense of defeat pressed on him, a raging hopelessness. He felt the midwife watching him in a stark consternation, while there, pressed back against the wall where she had all the time remained, her hand pressed to her throat, uttering no sound. Her eyes, burning upon him, was the old woman. He remembered her longing for a grandchild, as great as had been her daughter's longing for this child. All dashed away now, futile, beyond remedy. The floor was now a draggled mess. Stumbling over a sopping towel, Andrew almost dropped the child, which was now wet and slippery in his hands, like a strange white fish. For mercy's sake, doctor, whimpered the midwife, it's stillborn. Andrew did not heed her. Beaten, despairing, having labored in vain for half an hour, he still persisted in one last effort, rubbing the child with a rough towel, crushing and releasing the little chest with both his hands, trying to get breath into the limp body. And then, as by a miracle, the pygmy chest, which his hands enclosed, gave a short, convulsive heave, another, and another. Andrew turned giddy, the sense of life springing beneath